Welcome back to Rapture Tales. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and get ready for another story you won't forget. Let's dive back to the story. Elena Whitmore woke before sunrise, as she always did, because she liked to meet the city while it was still honest. Chicago's lake breeze slipped through the apartment window and brushed across the drafting table where she had fallen asleep over restoration sketches. She worked for a small architectural preservation studio, a job that paid modestly but gave her a strange happiness. She restored forgotten buildings so people could remember what once mattered. Her fiancé Julian Ashford teased her gently about caring more for old brick than new glass towers, yet he admired the way she spoke about history as if it breathed. Their mornings were simple: coffee, lake fog, and a conversation that never felt forced. They had met 4 years earlier when she corrected his measurement mistake during a charity renovation project. He had laughed instead of being embarrassed, and she had loved him for that immediately. Julian came from a family that valued steadiness over spectacle. His brother Lucas ran the family accounting firm with military discipline, but Julian worked in urban planning because he believed cities should feel human. He proposed to Elena privately along the river walk with no cameras, no audience, and no ring box theatrics, just a small velvet pouch and trembling hands. She said yes before he finished speaking. He loved that she was calm, not dramatic. She loved that he never tried to impress her. They built routines instead of fantasies. Yet whenever Julian visited the Whitmore house, the warmth shifted. Catherine Whitmore welcomed him with polished politeness that felt rehearsed, and Vanessa Whitmore watched Elena with a soft smile that never reached her eyes. The house always felt quieter after Julian left, like something exhaled. Thomas Whitmore rarely noticed. Business trips carried him across continents, and he trusted Catherine to manage the household. Elena wanted to believe the tension lived only in her imagination. She explained it away as personality differences, as grief residue from losing her mother years earlier. She avoided conflict by nature and preferred distance to confrontation. Still, small things lingered, conversations stopping when she entered, her mail moved, Catherine asking unusually detailed questions about wedding dates and finances. None of it was enough to accuse, but enough to disturb sleep. She promised herself it would ease after the wedding. Happiness would normalize the family. She believed patience solved most problems. The engagement dinner happened on a rainy evening, candlelight reflecting on crystal glasses while Catherine played gracious hostess. Vanessa hugged Elena a second too long, whispering congratulations with a voice that trembled strangely. Julian sensed unease but could not name it. Catherine asked precise questions about legal documents, future housing, and insurance policies, laughing softly when Julian seemed puzzled. She framed curiosity as maternal concern. Thomas toasted love without noticing Catherine's eyes calculating across the table. Elena focused on Julian's hand resting beside hers and ignored the feeling she was being measured. Over the next weeks Catherine grew unusually attentive, offering to help with planning details Elena had not yet finalized. Vanessa volunteered to assist with invitations, venues, even florist consultations, insisting sisters should share everything. Elena felt guilty refusing kindness, so she accepted. Julian admired her effort to include family. Relieved tension seemed to fade. But occasionally Vanessa asked peculiar questions: what time Elena left work, when she met clients, whether she ever visited the old garden shed behind the property anymore. Elena assumed nostalgia motivated her. They had once used the shed for childhood art projects. She answered casually, never realizing she was providing a schedule. Maya Bennett, Elena's closest friend, noticed the difference first. Over coffee she remarked that Catherine was behaving less like a stepmother and more like a manager. Elena laughed it off, yet Maya insisted people rarely change without purpose. She advised Elena to slow wedding planning and watch. Elena promised she would but did not. She wanted harmony, not suspicion. Meanwhile Julian confided to Lucas that Catherine seemed overly invested. Lucas suggested it was protective parenting. Neither imagined danger, they thought in emotional conflicts, not calculated ones. A week later Vanessa asked Elena to help organize boxes in the backyard shed, claiming Catherine wanted to renovate it into a studio. The afternoon was bright, ordinary, and harmless. Elena carried notebooks and measuring tape inside while Vanessa pretended to search for extension cords. The air smelled of old wood and dust. As Elena knelt to check floorboards, she heard the door shut behind her with a sound too final to be accidental. At first she assumed wind. Then the handle refused to turn. Her laughter faded into confusion. Vanessa's voice slipped through the door, unusually calm. She said it was temporary, that everything would be easier soon. Elena demanded explanation but heard footsteps retreating instead. Minutes later Catherine spoke, not angry, not emotional, just composed. She explained the world would believe Elena was gone and that resistance would only prolong discomfort. Elena thought it was a cruel joke until silence replaced conversation. Panic rose slowly, like water filling lungs. Hours stretched into night. The shed had a small water container meant for gardening and a narrow window too high to reach. She shouted until her throat burned, then listened to the house carrying on with normal sounds, dishes, television, footsteps. No one came. Her mind tried logic first, assuming misunderstanding, but Catherine's certainty replayed endlessly. Sleep arrived in fragments, fear replacing reasoning. She clung to the belief Julian would notice quickly. He always noticed. The next morning footsteps approached, and Catherine slid a small ration of water through a gap beneath the door without opening it. She spoke gently, explaining authorities already believed Elena missing after a supposed accident near the lake. The words felt unreal, yet Catherine described details too organized to be invented spontaneously. Elena felt the first true fracture of hope. Still, she counted hours, convinced rescue would come. Julian received the call that evening. Police explained Elena had likely fallen into the lake during an early walk. Her belongings were discovered near the shoreline. He rejected it immediately, insisting she never walked there at that hour. Lucas urged calm while officers promised investigation. Catherine arrived with controlled grief, supporting the narrative flawlessly. Her performance steadied the story, and doubt weakened around structured facts. Julian searched for days anyway, exhaustion overtaking logic. Inside the shed Elena marked time by sunlight patterns creeping across the floor. Hunger sharpened awareness. She memorized Catherine's routine footsteps and Vanessa's lighter pace. Anger slowly replaced pleading. She tested wood seams, nails, hinges. Survival shifted from waiting to planning. She realized rescue might never come unless she created it herself. Weeks passed outside in mourning rituals. Julian stood at a memorial overlooking the water, numb rather than crying. Vanessa comforted him persistently, her sympathy careful and patient. Catherine suggested grief counseling and frequent visits, positioning Vanessa as support. Lucas remained uneasy but lacked contradiction. Evidence favored tragedy, and grief prefers explanation over uncertainty. In captivity Elena grew thinner but clearer. She rationed strength, drank rainwater through the cracked window frame, and studied rust on the interior lock. Each day she worked silently, conserving energy. Fear evolved into determination. She stopped shouting for help and began whispering promises to herself instead. Time outside rearranged relationships. Julian, isolated in mourning, leaned on Vanessa's constant presence. She mirrored Elena's habits subtly, favorite tea, similar phrases, familiar routines, never obvious enough to alarm him. Catherine guided gently, suggesting companionship healed loss. Julian resisted at first, but grief erodes certainty slowly. One afternoon an elderly neighbor, Arthur Green, paused near the yard after hearing faint movement. He assumed animals and left, yet the sound lingered in his mind. He mentioned it casually to Catherine days later. She laughed and blamed raccoons disturbing old tools. He accepted the explanation but began noticing how carefully the shed remained locked. Inside, Elena finally loosened one hinge enough to shift the door slightly. It was not escape yet, but proof confinement was not permanent. She saved energy afterward, knowing the final effort would demand everything. She waited for the right moment, though she did not know what defined right, only that survival depended on patience. Months after the supposed accident, Catherine proposed closure through acceptance. She suggested Julian deserved peace and companionship again. Vanessa resisted publicly but privately encouraged conversation. Julian hated himself for considering moving forward yet feared permanent paralysis. He agreed only to talk, nothing more. Meanwhile, Elena widened the hinge gap millimeter by millimeter, counting breaths to measure progress. Her body weakened, but her mind hardened. She no longer imagined rescue, she imagined arrival, walking back into her life and forcing truth into daylight. The idea sustained her more than food ever could. By early spring, Julian began accompanying Vanessa to social gatherings, not as romance but not entirely platonic either. Friends approved gently, believing healing underway. Lucas remained conflicted yet supported his brother's need for stability. Catherine orchestrated timing carefully, never pushing too quickly, never allowing distance. One stormy night, wind rattled the shed hard enough to loosen the final rusted screw Elena had been weakening for weeks. She used the last of her strength to pry the door open just enough to slip through. The cold air outside felt unreal against her skin. Freedom arrived not as triumph but as exhaustion. She collapsed briefly against the grass before forcing herself upright. From the house came voices discussing final wedding preparations scheduled that very day. The words struck harder than captivity ever had. She realized time had not waited for her survival. She staggered toward the road, determined to reach the ceremony before vows sealed the lie forever. The road blurred beneath Elena Whitmore's unsteady steps, but the cold air forced clarity into her mind. She did not move toward the city yet. Instinct drew her first to the far end of the neighborhood where the houses grew older and the sidewalks cracked. She knew she could not walk straight into the life she had left. She needed proof she still existed beyond her own memory. Every breath scraped her throat, and the daylight felt painfully bright after months in dimness. She reached a public restroom near a lakeside jogging trail and locked herself inside, staring at her reflection. The woman in the mirror did not resemble the person she remembered. Dirt traced her skin, her hair hung unevenly, and her eyes carried a stillness she had never seen before. For a moment she almost doubted herself. Then she whispered her own name aloud until it felt real again. She washed slowly using cold water, not to restore appearance but to restore control. Each movement steadied her thoughts. Catherine had told the world she was gone, so the world would not be ready to believe otherwise without certainty. Elena searched the pockets of the oversized gardening coat she still wore and found a rusted nail she had used on the hinge. She kept it carefully, a small symbol of persistence. Outside, joggers passed without noticing her. Ordinary life moved without interruption, which angered her more than cruelty had. She had imagined the world would pause in tragedy. Instead, it had continued politely. As she stepped back onto the street, she overheard two women discussing a wedding reception scheduled that afternoon at a historic hotel downtown. The groom's name carried faintly in the wind, Julian Ashford. The sound froze her completely. The world did not spin or crash, it simply narrowed into a single direction. She began moving again, faster than her body should allow, fueled by a certainty stronger than exhaustion. She did not plan what she would say. She only knew she had to arrive before a vow erased her existence. Across the city, Julian Ashford stood inside a quiet dressing room staring at his reflection without recognizing the expression on his face. He wore a suit chosen more by circumstance than joy. Months of persuasion had worn him down rather than convinced him. He had agreed to the ceremony because grief had become heavier than acceptance, and everyone insisted moving forward honored memory rather than replaced it. Vanessa Whitmore had never demanded affection, she had only remained present. That constancy felt easier than loneliness. Still, as he adjusted his cufflinks, his chest tightened inexplicably, like a forgotten promise trying to surface. Lucas Ashford watched his brother carefully, unable to shake the unease that had followed him since Elena's disappearance. Facts had never fully aligned. The shoreline where her belongings were found lacked disturbance. The timeline relied heavily on Catherine's testimony. Yet doubt without evidence only prolonged pain, and he feared hurting Julian more by reopening questions. He told himself today was closure. Even so, he kept glancing toward the entrance hall as if expecting interruption he could not justify. Vanessa prepared in another room surrounded by stylists and soft music. Her hands trembled until Catherine steadied them. Catherine spoke gently, reminding her that happiness required decisiveness and hesitation ruined opportunity. Vanessa repeated rehearsed calmness in the mirror. She had waited through Julian's mourning, shaped herself into comfort, and convinced herself destiny sometimes required courage others lacked. Still, a faint unease lingered beneath her excitement, a sense that something unfinished remained beyond her control. Maya Bennett sat in a cafe nearby, staring at a newspaper announcement she had read 3 times. She had never accepted Elena's death. The timing, the absence of witnesses, the quick certainty, none of it matched the friend she knew. She had spent months searching hospitals and records quietly, but without proof she became only a voice people pitied. Today's wedding felt wrong in a way she could not explain logically. She debated attending uninvited simply to ease her conscience. Eventually she stood, deciding she would rather be embarrassed than silent if truth still existed somewhere. Arthur Green, the elderly neighbor, watered plants in his yard and paused again at the silent shed. Since the memorial he had expected it to be cleared or reproposed, yet it remained locked and untouched. The memory of faint movement months earlier resurfaced with unusual force. He considered mentioning it again but dismissed himself as imaginative. He never learned the door now hung slightly misaligned. Traffic roared near the downtown hotel as guests gathered beneath tall glass windows. Elena reached the building breathless, unnoticed among crowds. She did not enter immediately. Through the open doors she saw flowers, white fabric, and people smiling politely. The scene looked distant, like something belonging to a life she once read about rather than lived. For a moment fear threatened to root her in place, fear not of Catherine or Vanessa, but of discovering Julian had truly moved on. Then she remembered the shed's darkness and stepped forward. Inside, the ceremony had begun. Pastor Henry Caldwell spoke calmly while sunlight filtered through stained glass across polished floors. Julian listened without hearing, Vanessa held her bouquet with controlled anticipation, and Catherine observed with satisfied composure. The atmosphere carried a fragile stillness, as if the moment balanced on an invisible edge. The doors opened behind the guests with a sound louder than it should have been. Heads turned gradually rather than all at once, curiosity shifting into confusion. A thin woman stood at the entrance, clothes worn and eyes unwavering. Recognition traveled unevenly across faces until it reached the altar. Julian stopped breathing. Vanessa's hands loosened around the flowers. Catherine's posture collapsed before her expression could adjust. Elena did not shout. She walked slowly forward, every step reclaiming space that had been taken from her. Silence replaced ceremony entirely. When she finally spoke, her voice carried roughness but not hesitation. She stated her name simply, then looked directly at Julian as though no one else existed. The room felt suspended between disbelief and comprehension, and no one moved to stop her. For several seconds no one reacted because the mind refuses what it cannot categorize. Julian Ashford stared at Elena Whitmore as if memory had stepped into the present without permission. The color drained from his face first, then returned all at once. Vanessa's bouquet slipped from her hands and struck the polished floor with a soft thud that echoed louder than any scream. Catherine Whitmore's composure cracked in a way no one in the room had ever witnessed before. She did not faint, she did not protest, she simply stood motionless, calculating faster than panic could spread. Guests whispered, some stepping back, some forward, uncertain whether they were witnessing tragedy or miracle. Pastor Caldwell lowered the ceremony book slowly, understanding instinctively that whatever this was, vows could not continue. Elena stopped several feet from the aisle's end, steadying herself on a chair back for balance. Her voice remained low but carried through the silence. She did not accuse immediately. Instead she described being locked inside the garden shed behind her own home, rationed water, counting footsteps, memorizing days by sunlight angles. The simplicity of her words made them impossible to dismiss as hysteria. Julian took a step forward, then another, until he stood only an arm's length away. He searched her face for contradiction and found details only memory could hold, the faint scar near her eyebrow from a childhood fall, the habit of holding her breath before speaking something important. He whispered her name once, barely audible, and the sound alone confirmed reality for him. Vanessa shook her head repeatedly, muttering that grief had conjured illusions, but the tremor in her voice betrayed certainty slipping away. Catherine finally spoke, insisting this was confusion, that Elena had suffered trauma and imagined captivity after presumed accident. Yet her explanation lacked the confident polish she normally wielded. Guests began recording quietly on their phones, not out of spectacle but disbelief. Lucas Ashford stepped beside Julian, his long-held doubts igniting into sharp focus as pieces aligned. Maya Bennett pushed through the crowd moments later, breathless from rushing across town. The instant she saw Elena, she did not hesitate. She crossed the aisle and embraced her despite dirt and exhaustion. That simple human reaction shifted the atmosphere. Doubt turned into attention. Elena explained she escaped only hours earlier and came directly here after hearing the wedding plans outside the house. She asked that authorities be called, not dramatically but firmly, and the request itself carried the weight of truth. When police arrived, conversation fractured into statements and timelines. Officers escorted Catherine and Vanessa aside for questioning while paramedics checked Elena's condition. She refused to leave until Julian heard everything from her directly. Sitting together in a quiet room off the hall, she recounted months of survival, loosening hinges, collecting rainwater, marking time with scratches on wood. Julian listened without interrupting, hands shaking, guilt rising heavier than grief ever had. He realized every moment Vanessa comforted him had rested on a lie crafted before his eyes. Lucas provided officers with earlier inconsistencies he had noticed, and Maya described her failed attempts to obtain official confirmation of Elena's death. The story formed a coherent structure quickly. Catherine maintained composure but could not explain why the shed remained locked or why she reported certainty without recovery of a body. Vanessa's calm unraveled into fragmented denials that contradicted themselves. By evening both were escorted from the venue while stunned guests departed quietly. Elena finally allowed medical transport to a hospital for evaluation. The sterile room felt surreal after months of confinement. Nurses treated dehydration and malnutrition while Julian remained in a chair beside her bed, unwilling to leave. Conversation between them moved carefully. Forgiveness was not immediate, yet connection survived. She told him she never blamed him for believing the lie, only for not trusting his doubts longer. He accepted that truth silently, knowing regret would linger. Days passed as investigations confirmed evidence, the shed's interior markings, fingerprints on locks, staged items by the lakeshore. Arthur Green reported hearing movement months earlier, strengthening the timeline. Public reaction shifted from disbelief to outrage, though Elena avoided attention entirely. She focused on recovery, walking short distances, relearning ordinary routines, choosing clothes not for survival but comfort. Julian visited daily, sometimes speaking, sometimes simply sitting. Meanwhile Vanessa, separated from Catherine legally, began confronting the weight of what she had chosen. Without her mother's direction she appeared smaller, uncertain, admitting she convinced herself opportunity justified cruelty. Her statements provided further clarity for investigators. Catherine remained composed but increasingly isolated. Understanding control had vanished permanently. Weeks later Elena returned briefly to the lakeside path where her life had split into before and after. Julian joined her without invitation. They walked slowly, neither forcing reconciliation nor avoiding it. Trust would rebuild through time, not declarations. She spoke about wanting a future defined by her own decisions, not fear. He agreed, promising presence rather than promises. By early summer legal proceedings concluded, and attention gradually faded. Elena resumed architectural work part-time, restoring spaces once again, though she now valued open windows more than aesthetic detail. Maya partnered with her on a small design project converting neglected buildings into community spaces, an idea born during recovery when Elena realized how many people lived unseen in plain sight. Months after the interrupted ceremony, Elena and Julian met at the river walk where they had once become engaged. No ring, no crowd, no urgency. They discussed starting over as two people choosing each other again rather than resuming where they had stopped. The decision felt calmer than romance but stronger than memory. They left together quietly, not as survivors escaping the past but as individuals stepping into something earned rather than assumed. That's all for today. Like, subscribe, and see you in the next episode. Stay tuned.